to Flourish-Meant, the podcast on living life as you are meant to, so you can flourish. Welcome, everyone. I am honored today to have a sought-after international keynote and conference speaker with me. His name is Craig von Buseck, and he's a multi-published author. He's also the managing editor for inspirationtoday.com in Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome to Flourish-Meant, Craig.
Oh, thank you, Tina. It is an honor and pleasure to be with you today.
We're going to talk today about From Ruin to Greatness, which is really reflected in your new book about Ulysses S. Grant. Tell the listeners what made you feel so passionate about uncovering this story of ruin to greatness, as I feel many people can relate to the ruin part of it in the life of Ulysses S. Grant.
Well, Ulysses S. Grant is probably one of the most misunderstood figures in American history and possibly one of the greatest leaders that we've ever had. He has been misrepresented. Throughout his life, he was always misunderstood, and people did not see in him a lot of the qualities that he had, at least not at first, because Grant was a quiet man. He was raised by a very staunch Methodist mother, and Hannah Grant, his mother, taught him to be slow to speak and slow to anger and quick to love, as the book of James speaks of. And so that's how Grant lived out his life. He was a quiet man, but he was a man of incredible action. And so there were times in his life that he did very well because of his talent as a leader. And then other times where he had stumbled and had difficulty. Part of that was due to his problem with alcoholism. He did have a problem with drinking in different parts of his life, and it did trip him up. But he was actually able to overcome and eventually stepped into abstinence and stopped drinking altogether. So he had some real difficulties as a result of that just before the Civil War. And it almost kept him from getting back into the army. He had to resign from the army as a result of being drunk on duty. And then when the Civil War approached, he tried to get back in because he was actually quite talented and quite a brilliant leader. But no one would let him in for the first few months because he had a reputation as a drunk. Even though he was not a heavy drinker, his physical nature couldn't take that much alcohol. And so when he would drink, he would get drunk very quickly. And that led to some real problems for him. Well, he finally got back into the war, and we know what happened. He was promoted rapidly up the chain. And within just a little over 2 years, he went from captain to lieutenant general, which was the same rank that George Washington had. And he ended up being the leader that helped to win the war. So then, of course, he was elected two-term president. And when he left the White House, he went on a 2-year tour of the world, visiting all kinds of different dignitaries, from Queen Victoria to the Pope to, to going to Jerusalem and seeing the Great Wall of China and all that. When he came back to America, he needed to get a job because back then presidents didn't have a pension, and he had given up his army pension to run for president. And so he started in with his son in an investment firm on Wall Street called Grant and Ward. And everything seemed to be going great. And, Ulysses' job was to bring in all of his rich and powerful friends. And he was doing that. And he thought that he was worth $1 million. But then overnight, it was discovered that their partner, a man named Ferdinand Ward, was running a giant Ponzi scheme the whole time. And so overnight, this house of cards collapsed, and Grant went from being worth $1 million to having exactly $80 in his pocket. And so he didn't know what he was going to do next. So he started writing some articles to just make money. And this company called the Century Company, which would be like Life or Time Magazine today, they wanted him to write his memoirs. And he was considering that, working on these articles, when he was at his summer cottage in Long Branch, New Jersey. and he bit into a peach, and he cried out in pain because he thought that he had been stung by an insect in that peach. But it wasn't an insect, and the pain continued for the next 2 or 3 months. He finally went to the doctor, and they told him the very sad news that he had incurable throat cancer. So now he's bankrupt and has throat cancer. He's dying and doesn't have really a steady income. And so he immediately moved forward to try to start writing his memoirs. And his old friend, Mark Twain, had his own publishing company. And when Twain heard the rumor that Grant was writing his memoirs, he came to him and he said, "Hey, you remember that I talked to you about writing your memoirs 2 years ago, and you weren't ready at that time. I would like for you to do the memoirs for my company." So in the end, Grant decided to go with Mark Twain. And so for the last year of his life, in excruciating pain, he wrote his personal memoirs in an effort to restore his family's fortune so that his wife and children would be taken care of after his death. It was a tremendous act of love and heroism and courage. He finished those memoirs 4 days before he died. His funeral in New York City had 1.5 million people that attended, still the largest funeral ever in American history. And Twain went ahead and published the books later that year. And in the end, they ended up making for his wife $450,000, which is equivalent to about $10 million. So in this final act of love and courage, Grant truly triumphed and showed the character that he had all of his life. And this was just another time when he overcame the obstacles by his faith in God, his education, his family, and strong, hard work to see this thing come to pass. So it really is an amazing story from ruin to greatness.
And his story sounds more like a roller coaster than a straight trajectory from ruin to greatness, because he went from the ruin of his own issues with alcohol and overcoming that and rising above the problems with his reputation to continue to persevere to make his life something of worth and meaning. And then from that place where he finally found victory and finally found purpose, he fell again into a difficult spot. And I think a lot of people are in that place right now where they've tried to overcome and they've gone through this difficult year of crises and being oppressed and loss and all of those things that you're talking about in Grant's story. What do you think readers could learn from studying Ulysses S. Grant's life about how to recover from the losses, be it one loss or a huge tide of loss after loss after loss in their lives? How can they learn from what Ulysses S. Grant showed us in his life?
There are some significant character traits that were very strong in Grant that helped him to recover because, as you pointed out, he was knocked back again and again and again. So we talked about how, he had gone to California. The Army has sent him out there. And this was before there was any intercontinental railroad and there were no roads to get across the continent. And so he had to leave his wife and child, and there was another child that was on the way. And he went down on a sailing ship to Panama and then across the Panama Isthmus, which was totally plagued by cholera. And they lost just dozens and dozens of the soldiers died on the way from cholera. And that was the first place where Grant really showed his character strength in an amazing way, in that he helped keep several of those soldiers alive and their family members and so forth. But he was also very compassionate to those who had lost so much. So Grant got out to the West Coast and he was very lonely without his wife. And he tried everything that he could. He tried to plant crops and they were flooded and they were killed. He tried to invest in businesses in San Francisco and people would steal his money. He tried actually to bring ice down from Alaska on a ship to San Francisco, and they had mechanical problems on the way and all the ice melted. And so time and time again, he tried these different schemes and they didn't work. And so it raised he really became hopeless. And that's when he started to drink. And unfortunately, he couldn't handle his liquor. And so he was given a choice either to be court martialed or to resign. And he didn't want to put his wife through the embarrassment if he was found guilty of the court martial. So he resigned and he went back to St. Louis and he started to farm some land that his wife's father had given to him. And he worked extremely hard on that land. It was never in Grant's life, his hardships were never from his lack of hard work. So that's one of his character strengths. He was willing to roll up his sleeves wherever he went and work hard. Unfortunately, America was hit by its first Great Depression right when Grant was a farmer. And people forget that. They say that, oh, Grant was a failure during those years in St. Louis. Well, he wasn't a failure. The whole country had a failure. And so, again, he ended up leasing out his farm and he went into St. Louis to work first in some real estate in bill collection. That didn't work out. And in the end, he tried to sell firewood on the street, and that wasn't working. So finally, he recognized that he needed to go to his father, who was a very successful businessman. He had a chain of leather goods stores. And Grant humbled himself and went to his father seeking employment and had to go under even further humiliation because he was placed under his brother as a clerk in the leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. But part of that was a strategy because Grant saw that the country was starting to come apart. And so he knew he needed to move from St. Louis, which was in the South, back up to the North, where he could join the Northern forces in the Army. And so, like I said earlier, he wasn't able to get in with an officer's commission at first. So what he did was he took whatever he could get. And the only job that he was offered was a mustering officer, mustering in the new recruits. Well, he did that job with such diligence and expertise that everyone around him was very impressed. And eventually, when one of the colonels of a regiment just totally failed and his regiment had just fallen out of all discipline, the officers of that regiment went to the governor of Illinois and said, "We need a new colonel, and we would like you to give us Ulysses S. Grant." So again, because of his hard work, because of his persistence, because of his strong family support, he was able to get through that crisis and was named as a colonel. And within only a few months, he was named brigadier general. Within a few more months, he was named major general. And then within a couple of years, he was lieutenant general, leading 1 million men in the Army of the Union. So it's a remarkable story of persistence, strong family values. He went to West Point, so he had a great education, which he employed in all of these things. And then faith in God and hard work.
I'm hearing a story of a man who's not prideful. We would think if we looked back at a story about a leader like Ulysses S. Grant, that this would be a proud man, but he doesn't sound like a proud man. He sounds like a man who was very others focused, a man who was very humble. And for those who are struggling, I think that's a key to hard work. We give up when we're thinking about only ourselves. But Ulysses S. Grant, his story teaches us that our humility, putting other people's needs first, will help us get through a crisis, to see the needs of someone who could benefit from that next little step toward what God has for us tomorrow. Even if we failed today, even if we failed yesterday and the day before, the Lord's call is to keep moving forward in humility to do the next thing that could possibly benefit someone else. So I'm hearing a story of compassion, like you said, in his own era of pandemic with cholera, which we're experiencing today, a new kind of pandemic. He was compassionate toward others. He was humble enough to work as hard as he could for the sake of those around him. How do you feel that other people can be inspired by that right now?
Well, I actually have a companion book to the biography that's coming out in May. So the biography comes out in April. The biography is called Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. Then the companion book is called Forward, The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. And in that book, I point out there's an author named Jim Collins, and he has a book called Good to Great, which is a very popular leadership book. And in that book, they did several years, he and his team did several years of research on corporations that had gone from just a good corporation to a truly great corporation. And one of the things that they observed is that the leaders of the great corporations were all humble leaders. They were not looking to raise their own star. They were not looking to be some sort of celebrity. They were looking for the success of their teams and the success of their companies. And as I read the description of what he said the great leader was for these great companies, it was Ulysses S. Grant to a T. It was really rather remarkable. And so there's much to be learned because, as you and I know, these are biblical principles. The Bible says that humble yourself and in due time you will be exalted, and that the Lord does not despise those who are humble, but he raises them up. And Jesus spoke about the person who would not take the head seat at the table, but would wait to be called. And that was exactly the type of character that Ulysses S. Grant had. And it was one of the reasons why he caught the attention of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had a series of very prideful, arrogant generals who actually did quite terribly. And many people said that derogatory manner to Grant. They say that he was just a butcher and he was just, he had hammer blows against the South, and he just beat the South because he had more people and more resources. And my answer to that is, well, the 6 generals before him had all the same resources and all the same number of men, but they didn't win against Robert E. Lee. And one of the major reasons was that they were arrogant. A couple of them were unbelievably disrespectful to President Lincoln. Whereas General Grant came in, and he came in as a servant leader, as Ken Blanchard points out, that whole concept of the servant leader, who is the one who comes in and doesn't make grandiose claims or doesn't embarrass or criticize the leader, but just goes to work on the problem and works it through to a solution. And that was Ulysses S. Grant. One of the reasons that he had such success was, as you point out, that tremendous humility.
And that is really the key of from ruin to greatness. We know that all we have is ruin. All that we have is nothing compared to what Christ has to offer through us. And when we recognize that, that's the only way that we can ever experience or be part of the greatness of God.
Amen.
So this is the story of Ulysses S. Grant, and could be our story too. Isn't that right?
I believe so. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I was attracted to this story, was just this incredible person. He was a common man. And one of the things that I point out in both books is there was really a handing of the baton at Appomattox from the more aristocratic and the more top down, kind of genteel aristocracy of the Revolutionary period that would be embodied in Robert E. Lee, to the more common man that would be embodied in Ulysses S. Grant. Lee's father was the right-hand man of General George Washington in the war. And we hear so much about the Lees of Virginia and the blue blood of Virginia and all that kind of thing. But Grant was the son of a humble tanner from Ohio. And I actually went to several of Grant's homes and I visited his birthplace. And some people would look at it like a garage today. It was just this small little house on the banks of the Ohio River outside of Cincinnati. And yet from that humble place, he rose to be general of the army that defeated the rebellion. He rose to be a 2-term president, and he rose to write his personal memoirs, which ended up being the second biggest seller of the 19th century, second only to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there's much to be said in this whole aspect of not looking as much at who your family line was or where you come from or what your title is, but what do you do? What are your actions? What are your deeds? How do you treat people? I think that's more biblical approach. And it's what I believe we now as a culture are looking more carefully at the character rather than the resume.
That is so true. And how we treat people matters, whether we have an important job or what the world may say is not as an important job, because every interaction with another person shows our character.
I absolutely agree. You know, my grandmother she would work at a candy store that she and my grandfather started, like a corner store during the day, but that was not enough to make ends meet. My grandfather had a stroke, and so he was not able to work other than in the corner store. And so at night, my grandmother would go and she would clean the local high school that was a block away from her house. And so my grandfather on my other side was a maintenance worker in a steel mill. And so I come from a blue collar background of kind of salt of the earth people who just did what was necessary to take care of their family. And I think that no matter what the success that we have in life, if we lose sight of the fact that the ground is level at the foot of the cross, and the Bible says there is no one better than anyone else. We are all sinners, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the only reason we have worth at all is not because of what we do, although that can be a blessing to others and it can be an inspiration to others. But it's really about what God has done for us in sending Jesus to be our sacrifice on the cross. We receive that by faith and we say, thank you so much. And then our role is really to be a reflection of that love to others here in the world.
It's remarkable how much Ulysses S. Grant's story will teach us about how to respond to failure after failure, loss after loss, with humility and grace and compassion. And I think that's something that we can use today. What are some things that people can fix their hearts and their minds on today, just as Ulysses S. Grant did in his times of utter loss and failure? And he wasn't always successful at it. So, what are some things that people, whether they've experienced the moral failure or they've experienced financial issues or loss or business failures, what are some things that they can fix their mind on to help them keep moving forward?
It's very interesting. You know, as an alcoholic, Grant had a combination of, on the one side, the disease of alcoholism. And that disease was very strong in his life and in his family. Sadly, his youngest brother, Orville, died of alcohol poisoning, in his mid 40s. So he was a young man and he died because he was an alcoholic. Grant had that same physical tendency. And so we realize that alcoholism is a disease. And those who are alcoholics, the modern research has shown us, and Grant didn't know these things as far as they didn't know the scientific element behind everything. But the modern research has shown us that someone with an alcoholic tendency has to basically abstain. They can't have a single drink because once they take one drink, they can't stop drinking. That's part of the disease. And so that's one side of it. But then you talk about the moral failures. And so Grant did have some moral failures that were connected to the disease. And it's a difficult thing because some people then and even now see someone who is an alcoholic as someone who's just made bad decisions. We know now that that's not the truth. We know that there is a problem with this disease of alcoholism. We also know, however, that those who don't get help and those who don't get what they need as far as support, then they start making all kinds of bad decisions. And the alcoholism just exasperates those bad decisions and makes life come to a point where it seems overwhelming. And that's exactly what happened to Grant. And so someone's problem may not be alcoholism. It might be drug abuse. It may be a sex addiction. It may be overworking. It may be wanting money too much. It may be being a perfectionist. It may be any number of different things that we all can struggle with as far as difficulties in our life. The question becomes, how do we overcome those things? So for Grant, there were some very key moments of change for him where he started to work his way out systematically out of the ravages of alcoholism. I actually have a whole chapter of this in the forward book about his leadership, because people need to know that leaders today have the same kind of struggles that everyone has. And so I wanted to write this chapter to say, okay, this is, Grant had this addiction. He had this disease of alcoholism. How did he overcome it? Well, he started first by going to his pastor. And so AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, talk about in their steps, they talk about the one key step is recognizing the need for a higher power, that we just as human beings have weaknesses. And so we need the help of God. Now, you and I believe that the God of the Bible, Jesus, and the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, that they are God, and that they have shown themselves and revealed themselves through the Word of God as a God of love, and a God of redemption, and a God of reconciliation. And so Ulysses S. Grant believed the same thing. He was a Christian. He was a strong Methodist. And so he talked to his pastor, and his pastor said, listen, you basically have to abstain. And that was the beginning of the abstinence. And then he worked with a partner, John Rollins, who was his lawyer for the leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. And Rollins joined the army with Grant, and Grant asked him to be his chief of staff. And Rollins said, listen, I think there's greatness in you, but I will only do this if you agree to abstain. And Grant made that agreement. Now, Grant slipped off the wagon a couple of times during the Civil War, never when it was a battle going on. It was always when there was boredom. And that was one of Grant's problems. He needed to be working. He didn't like being bored. And so a couple of times he ended up getting drunk when he was bored. One time he was sick, and the doctor prescribed alcohol. And that was the beginning of him going off the wagon. But for the most part, he stayed sober. And in large measure, it was because of the accountability he had with John Rollins. Then that one time when he really did fall off the wagon during the Vicksburg campaign, it scared him. And Rollins said, listen, you promised me and you broke your promise. And so at that point, Grant sent for his wife, because whenever Julia was there, he never drank. He didn't touch a drop when Julia was around. And so throughout the war, he kept his wife nearby. And so the accountability of John Rollins and his wife, the love and support of his wife and his family, those things all really helped him to get to the point where when he left the Civil War and became president, he never drank another drop. And he told people, they try to give him champagne during some diplomatic meeting. And he actually said, no, if I start drinking, I don't want to stop. And so he turned his wine glass over. And so he was able to actually overcome the alcoholism. And that's a tremendous example for the rest of us, whatever challenges we have, that through faith in God, through strong family connections, through accountability, and through abstinence from that thing, if necessary, God can help us to overcome.
Those are very good points, and they apply to us whether our struggles are struggles that are physical, struggles that are financial, struggles that are circumstantial, or struggles that are within any of our arenas of life. Those struggles can be met with faith. They can be met with accountability and fellowship, being strengthened by others around us, and by that humility and willingness to submit ourselves to what God asks us to do for that one next step. And that is true in Celebrate Recovery 12-step programs, as
Yes.
well as AA or NA or any of those other 12-step programs that you might seek, is just taking that one day at a time step through crisis, through trial. So those kinds of things, it's very important to remember we all have struggles. No one is alone, and not to see yourself in isolation in any of those times. Isolation is what really can cause us a problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting that when Grant was in isolation, that's when he slipped. And so I think you hit the nail right on the head. Those are the keys. And I think again also is a recognition that you have a problem. That's really the first step, is to get to the point where you say, I can't keep doing this. I'm hurting myself. I'm hurting my family. I'm hurting those I love, or my business, or whatever it may be. And that all begins with being honest with yourself, and then taking the steps necessary to start overcoming that thing.
Yes, we first overcome our pride, which is where our denial comes from, and begin
Exactly
to,
right.
yeah, take those steps from ruin, which we are all in ruin, to the greatness that only God can show through our lives. So thank you for bringing that wonderful first look at your book about Ulysses S. Grant, Victor. Tell us more about how people can find you and follow you and get in touch with you for all of the resources, because you have more than one book coming out and you have lots of projects going on all the time. How can people stay connected with you and get a copy of your book?
Well, to stay in touch with me, it's as easy as going to my website, which is my last name, VonBuseck.com, vonbuseck.com. To order the book, they can go to grantvictorbook.com, and it's available there. It's available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. And then also, we invite people to come to inspiration.org to check out the different articles, videos, teaching materials, and our social community for people. It's one of those places where people can find resources to help them on their journey, as we spoke of today.
Yes, there is a wealth of resources available at inspiration.org. I so appreciate all that you do through that ministry and through your own writing. And I'm so glad that you came to join us on Flourish-Meant today to share that with listeners.
Well, Tina, it has been a pleasure, and I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you.
I hope that all of you will check out all the amazing resources that Craig von Buseck is offering you today and will continue to be offering in his own writing and through inspiration.org. And I hope that you will also come back for the next episode of Flourishment.